Hello, everyone. There I am. I hope this finds you abiding in the love of our Lord and abounding in His grace. And since it's mid-October, but here in the Houston area, it is unseasonably warm and it's still about 112 degrees, I thought I would share another pic from Western New York from when we were there last week. And I wrote a little description about this tree and my experience beholding this tree. And I posted it to Facebook. And at the very end of our lesson, I think I'll include it there in case you're interested in it. But let's go ahead and jump right in. At long last, we come to the literary features of Mark's Gospel. And as you know, I love to look at this aspect of the biblical literature. And there's something I want us to keep in mind as we do so. It's good to pay attention, as I've often said, not only to what the text is saying, but how it is being said. And that's really what we're looking at when we are noticing these literary features. Not just to appreciate the skill with which the narratives are crafted and the beauty of the text, although that's certainly a great value of doing this, but also to notice the theology that is involved. So in other words, God is telling us something about Himself and His will that we need to understand, not only in what is said, but in how it is being said. And so we want to keep that in mind as we look at some of these features. And we've already noticed that, of course, and called attention to this when we were looking at the content and structure. We noticed that Mark's gospel begins and ends with this graphic verb referring to the heavens being torn open and the curtain of the temple being torn, and then the declaration of Jesus in both cases as the Son of God. And so we think that's a way of sort of bookending his whole account to highlight the importance of his presentation of Jesus as the Son of God by beginning that way and coming back to it and putting a cap on it in the same way at the end. That really brings it to our attention even more. Okay, so one of the things we'll notice about Mark's Gospel, if we were reading it in the original language especially, is that it's written in poor Greek. It's written seemingly clumsily or in a very unpolished Greek style. In fact, interestingly, Hippolytus, in the 3rd century, he referred to Mark as stump-fingered or mutilated in the fingers. And some think that that might be his way of talking about Mark's crude Greek style. By the way, Hippolytus, a church father and martyr, there are accounts of his martyrdom which tell us he was torn apart by horses, or that he was dragged through the streets and killed behind horseback that way. So why do we say his Greek is poor? Well, his grammar is crude. When he's writing, Mark will often shift tenses or have the wrong subject-verb agreement. It's often, his account is often pleonastic. Pleonastic. That's just a way of saying it's too wordy. A pleonasm is when you use more words than are necessary to describe something, and it can be redundant, like saying black darkness or burning fire. Another example of a pleonasm, exact replica. Or here's a good one, let me write it. When you say something is a true fact. Have you ever heard someone say that? Well, that's an example of a pleonasm. Or when you say someone is an arrogant Texan. Let me throw that one in there. That's a redundancy, right? No, Mark's account, though, is very wordy that way, and and so another way of saying it is it's repetitious. You'll see that in an example we're going to look at where he uses the word euthus, translated immediately. He uses it over and over and over and over in the same contexts. And if we were grading a student's paper in grammar class, we would mark off for that. But Mark isn't concerned, obviously, about proper style. His diction is somewhat vulgar, and all that means is he's not using highfalutin terminology and big words. He's speaking in a very simple way and very common language, I guess we could say. Not like, for example, what we'd find in Luke's Gospel, or especially the book of Hebrews, where you have a much more eloquent Greek. And it's the syntax is quite simple in his account as well. He uses parataxis a lot. Simple sentences run together with the word and. So this is happening, and then this happens, and then this, and then after this, then this, and then that. As opposed to the hypotactic, complex sentences that have lots of subordinating clauses and such, that was favored by classical Greek writers. Mark isn't writing that way. But when we think of his rather sloppy or poor Greek, still his overall construction is just very straightforward. It can be considered a writing style that is pursued in order to facilitate better storytelling. You can think of it as bad writing or really good storytelling, where you talk, or rather you write the way you talk. Now, we don't do that. When we write, we've learned you're not supposed to write in exactly the same way that you talk. But Mark seems to be more concerned about telling the story in a vivid way. We'll get to that in just a moment. That he writes the way he does for rhetorical effect and also theological effect, as we'll see. So the crude Greek doesn't mean that he's thrown together a clumsy narrative, that the narrative construction is sloppy. No, he's not just slapping together the accounts that he's received about the Jesus tradition, if we can say it that way. He's shaping them carefully, but he's doing it in a way that is quite vivid, which leads us to our next point. Even though Mark's Greek may be less refined than the other gospel writers, it is more colorful, and that gives us a very vivid storytelling style. And let me list some things for you that make his account such a vivid one, okay? First of all, it's fast-paced. And in what way are we suggesting it's a fast-paced narrative? Well, as we've already pointed out, it has a very abrupt beginning. He jumps right in media res, as we'd say. There, Rose, is your Latin for today, I think, and I know you want to see it written out. You'll feel better that way. So, in media res, he jumps in, and I hope this is coming out. Sometimes I make marks on the page and it doesn't. In the middle of things, that reads. I'll have to check that later and make sure I spelled that right. But he starts abruptly, and as I've pointed out, I believe his gospel ends very abruptly, and it's the shortest account that we have. Now, I'm more like Luke. It takes me a while to get going. Luke has, the lengthy birth narratives that gradually lead us in before we're introduced to Jesus himself. And so I guess I like a lot more setup and long drawn out beginnings, and some people don't, but there's rapid movement in Mark's gospel where there's quick changes from one scene to another. His time references are often vague, like simply saying, well, in those days or after some days. If you read through Mark's gospel and you didn't know better, you might think that everything he's telling you about basically happened in one day. But one of the things which shows us how fast-paced Mark's gospel is, more than anything else, I think, is his frequent use of this adverb euthus, and that is typically translated with the word immediately. Sometimes you'll find it in older translations as straightway, and that frequent use of that term propels the narrative forward. It creates this sense of action, this sense of excitement, and that's one of the reasons I really like Mark's gospel account. There's this movement created. Even though this might be overstating the case, you might think of Mark's gospel then as the gospel of action, where he's showing Jesus more by his deeds than his words. You know what that makes me think of if I'm going to compare the gospel accounts? The old Batman comic and then cartoon, where you'd have the pow and the bam and the blap. You know, I'm thinking of the days when I would come home from school and see Adam West playing Batman on the television series. And again, you'd have that, like that idea of that pow and that bang. And to me, that's a little bit what Mark's trying to do in the movement of his gospel, is just kind of take you to the next thing and the next thing and the next thing, and just kind of hit you one thing after another after another. And so it's an exciting read for sure. And since it figures so prominently into his narrative, let's look a little bit more at this word euthus, and think of how much more we see it in Mark. It helps when we're trying to notice what's distinctive about a particular gospel to compare frequency of terms, as we've done several times along the way, with the other accounts. So with Matthew, you only find it 5 times. In Luke, it just appears once. But in Mark, which is much shorter, 42 times, and 11 times in the first chapter alone. For example, look at this. This is how chapter 1 looks in my olive tree Bible, beginning in verse 9, and I'm just going to circle some of them here to call our attention to them. But you'll notice right there in verse 10, and immediately. So let's keep going here. And then immediately, down in verse 12. And then we're going to continue here. Let me scroll the text up, and then look how much we're going to see it here. Immediately, verse 18, immediately, verse 20, verse 21, immediately, verse 23, and then immediately. It just keeps going. Let me scroll up here. Look at this. He says there's something similar at once, and then here in verse 29, immediately and immediately. Again and again and again. That's what we're going to see as we go through his gospel, but you see it especially here. Look down here when we get to the very last paragraph of this first chapter. Once again, and immediately the leprosy left him, and then you find Jesus telling him that Jesus sent him away at once. And so you see the effect of that frequent usage there, I'm sure. That term can also be translated, as I mentioned, straightway. And I think older British might be straight away. They might say with the extra A in there, but just straightway. Now, think about this. We're talking about how we find theology in these literary features. Well, look at how Mark's gospel begins. Consider the use of that term in light of his short 3-verse prologue, where he cites Isaiah 40 in verse 3 about making the path straight for the Lord. And that's the term eutheos. And you can just hear it, you can see how it's similar to, it's a cognate of that term eutheos. It's an adjective, and it just means straight. So you've got the adverb straight way, and you have this term straight. So he begins his gospel telling us, when he starts out, he lets us know that what I'm about to tell you in my account of the good news is that Jesus is fulfilling the prophecy of making, or rather John, as he comes and prepares the way for Jesus, is making his path straight. And then he goes back to a form of that word over and over in the Gospels. And I've seen it suggested that that's intentional to show us that every single time he's using that term, he's showing us this is the way, that what I'm telling you right here and what is happening now and what is happening next is how Jesus is fulfilling, and how this way has been made straight, and how Jesus is then moving in that way. Let me just show it to you here. Mark, you remember, quotes the Old Testament only sparingly, but he does so right here at the outset. And when he's citing Isaiah, prepare the way of the Lord, make his paths straight, he says. And so that's that term. And then he goes on to use a form of it, as we said, 42 times, suggesting that he's now telling you, as the account unfolds, the way in which Isaiah's prophecy is being fulfilled ultimately in the life, in the teaching and work, in the person of Christ. And another term is going to be used as well in conjunction with these others, erxito, which means began. You find it, you see here, only 6 times in Matthew, just a couple times in Luke, but look how many times you see it in Mark, 26 times. And the terms come together in chapter 2:23. If you look here, as they made a way, this is when they were going through the fields and were going to pluck some of the grain, and the text says, as they made a way, they began. And so you have these concepts sort of linked and related here, and let me show you how often. Let's see how frequently they appear in Mark's Gospel. We're not going to take the time to read all of these, but look at eutheus and erxito. Notice, for example, began, and this first line should be broken up into 2, chapter 1:45. The leper went out and began to publish it much, and then chapter 2, verse 23, his disciples began as they made a way. That's what we just alluded to. But then look, notice how many times Mark uses that term. Just seeing it, I think, really helps us to get the impact here from the text, just over and over and over again. And if someone wants all these references, you can pause the video and hopefully you can read them. And then now you see how much eutheus is used, and in older translations here, either straightway or immediately, or look at chapter 1, verse 29, forthwith or anon. Look at its appearance again and again and again and again. Obviously, then, Mark wants to keep us moving. Unlike Tyler, he wants to keep things moving along. Moving along. What else makes his account so vivid? The frequent use of what's called the historical present. And that's just when you talk about something that's already happened in the present tense as if it's happening at the time you're describing it. Now, the historical present, notice here, once more, the frequency of usage will show us just how much it's an emphasis in Mark's gospel. Matthew, which is much longer, we find it 78 times. In Luke, just 10 times. And different sources will have, I don't know why, but they'll have different numbers listed. And sometimes I try to check them and count them myself, but I didn't in this case. 78 times, 10 times. What about Mark? 151 times. So Mark's much shorter account makes much more frequent use of this rhetorical device. Let me give you an example that just came up recently. In fact, when we were in Western New York for my nephew Corey's funeral. Now here he is in the yellow shirt you see here. And by the way, if the audio is a little different, I switched rooms. I was in my home office, but I didn't like the echo I was getting. So now I'm back in the bedroom closet. But when we were home for the funeral, I asked Corey's grandparents, his father's parents, if they had any stories or anything they remember that they would like me to read at the funeral. And I love what they gave me, and especially since I've been waiting to point this out from Mark's Gospel, I love how they wrote a couple of the stories they wanted me to read, and I want to share them with you here because it's exactly what we find in Mark's Gospel. And I'm from Western New York, and I'm used to people talking this way, but down here in Texas and when I've lived in the Deep South and in Virginia, I didn't notice people would do this as often, use the historical present as often. But I typed up what they gave me, and here's how they wrote it for me. They typed it out, and I typed it out so I could bring it into the class here and have it in this form. So notice, here's how they wrote it. Grandpa or Grandma and Grandpa take Corey. Take Corey. So right away I'm struck by how they're using the present tense. Instead of, we took Corey to the Toronto Zoo. So they say we take Corey to the Toronto Zoo, and we are in the jungle exhibition with wild birds, and they are making so much noise, and Corey turns around. So this is what we do when we're trying to make a story especially vivid to someone. And that's exactly what they did. They brought the memory right out before us by describing it as though it's happening at that time. And then Corey looks at us and goes, instead of he looked at us and went or said. And notice in Western New York, we do this a lot where we'll say, and so the guy turns to me and he says to me, he goes, yeah, I said this to the guy, and he turns to me and he says to me, he goes, that's a Northeast thing, I believe, in a kind of a New York sort of thing, maybe New York, New Jersey kind of thing. But let's scroll down. Notice how they'll shift back and forth between tenses, because that's something that Mark does a lot. Notice, one day Grandpa Parisi is, present tense, bringing Corey over to his Grandma Candy and Bill. That's my mom and stepdad. And as he pulls in, he sees guys working on the roof, and he says, so it's all present tense, ooh, this is my lucky day. Now, when they want to give us a little historical tidbit so we understand why they're telling us that, they shift back to the past tense. He was obsessed with tools. One more. Then we are at Disney World. See, this really struck me when they gave it to me, and I said, I'm going to have to use that in my class. So we are at Disney World and standing in line to get on the Tower of Terror, and now, but back to the past tense. He was about 6 years old, and now back to the present. He is saying, ooh, this is nothing. And notice it's a run-on sentence. That's exactly what I was saying about Mark's kind of crude Greek style, that he just sort of runs things together like he's telling you a story. He's not trying to write a formal treatise. He's trying to tell us this story, and he's doing it in a way that's really capturing our attention. Well, that's just like we would tell something like this. he is saying, ooh, this is nothing. See, it all runs together. And all the adults are looking around at him and laughing like, okay, kid. Then we get on it, and the doors open, and it kind of tips you outside. Well, the look on his face was, so then they shift back to the past tense, pure terror, and we get off back to the present, and he goes, Grandma, I think I'm going to be sick, but he wasn't. But he did say, I'm never going on that again. Past tense. And then notice how it's just the sentence just runs on like that. It just a run-on sentence because they're just sitting around and typing up something as they're thinking about it to tell us, to relate to us a memory in a vivid way. It just seemed to me, I could tell when they typed this up, and this is just part of it, that they were kind of reliving it and seeing it again before their eyes. And that's what I think the use of the historical present does, and especially in Mark. And by the way, I forgot to mention, those are our kids with Corey in that picture. From the left to right, Jamie, who just had the baby, and Jessica and Justin, but that was from a while back. But now, notice the New American Standard Bible, in their preference, they tell us how they put asterisks, that's a tricky word for me to say for some reason, next to the verbs that are in the historical present. So notice what they explain about this in their translation, and then I'm going to show you some examples. Asterisks are used to mark verbs that are historical presents in the Greek, which have been translated with an English past tense in order to conform to modern usage. So they're not always rendering it with a present tense. Why? Well, because we don't talk that way generally in a narrative. So notice the translators recognize that in some contexts the present tense seems more unexpected and unjustified, but here's the key, to the English reader than a past tense would have been. But Greek authors frequently use the present tense for the sake of, and here's why. This is the point we're making, for the sake of heightened vividness. Yes, heightened vivid, to make the text more vivid to the reader. Thereby, and I love the way they say this, transporting their readers in imagination to the actual scene at the time of the occurrence. That's their understanding, and I think that is the point, and that's the effect it has for me when I read Mark's Gospel. But at the end they say, however, the translators felt that it would be wise to change these historical presents to English past tenses. So they think that they want you to know that the present tense is being used, so they put the asterisk, but they explain that they don't actually translate it in the present tense because that's not really proper English. But I'm glad they do that because I want to know when it's being used. I know it's non-colloquial English to do that. We don't use the historical present when we're writing more formally, but look at the impact it has if we go to Mark's Gospel, and especially in light of the other characteristics we noted that make it a vivid account. Let's compare the ESV and the New American Standard Bible here. Look at Mark 16. In the ESV, and very early on the first day of the week when the sun had risen, they went to the tomb. Okay, they went to the tomb, and they were saying to one another, who will roll away the stone for us from the entrance to the tomb? And looking up, they saw. Now, those are past tenses, but actually they're present tense in the Greek New Testament. Mark's using the historical present. So the New American Standard Bible, as we noted, you'll find there the asterisk. So they came very early on the first day of the week. They came, but really it's the present tense. They come to the tomb when the sun had risen. And they were saying to one another, "Who will roll away the stone for us from the entrance of the tomb?" Looking up, they saw, there's the past tense, but they have the asterisk. They see that the stone had been rolled away. So again, that's like vivid storytelling. They come to the tomb. They see the stone had been rolled away. Notice this is in chapter 1, and in verse 30, Simon's mother-in-law was lying sick with a fever, and notice past tense, and immediately they spoke to Jesus about her, but it's really they speak to Jesus about her. And then again, back to the past tense. So Mark is mixing tenses. They came, and she was, and he came, but in the middle of that, then the historical present. Well, I pointed that out to you in the text that Corey's grandparents gave me to read for the funeral. They were mixing tenses, but you still see how it makes the account vivid, and I want to show you a couple more examples. One that is, to me, tremendously powerful in its rhetorical effect. Now, I don't know exactly why, but even in the New American Standard Bible, where they're marking the historical presence with the asterisk, they didn't do it here. In chapter 2, verse 1, when he had come back to Capernaum several days afterward, it was heard that he was at home. So they're thinking, well, that's how we need to relay that in proper English, but in fact the Greek is, he is in the house. It was heard that he is in the house. Well, that's just an awkward way to say that in English, that people heard past tense that he is at home or he is in the house. So they didn't even mark that one with an asterisk. But notice then in verse 3, they came, but it's really they come bringing to him a paralytic. And then down below in verse 5, and Jesus, seeing their faith, says, it's really present tense, says to the paralytic, "Son, your sins are forgiven." Look at chapter 6. Jesus went out from there and came into his hometown, and his disciples followed him. But really, it is he comes into his hometown, and his disciples follow him. So you see the point, but now let's get to that powerful example. It's the crucifixion scene, and I think this really, when we read it with the historical presence, translated in the present tense, it really does captivate us. It really does arrest our attention and bring us right back to Calvary. And Mark is taking us there to see these events unfolding. Look at what I mean. Chapter 15 and verse 22. All right, so let's read it as the New American Standard Version has it, and as most translations have it with the past tense. Then they brought him to the place Golgotha, which is translated place of a skull. They tried to give him wine mixed with myrrh, but he did not take it. And they crucified him. I think those 4 words are, for the most significant in Scripture as far as the restraint of the writer, the understatement of the writer, to just state it so matter-of-factly, something this terrifying, this tremendous, this historic, this epic in the whole unfolding of the Bible story, and it's just described in just a couple of short words, just very matter-of-factly. And they crucified him, and they divided up his garments. And then once again, then down below, you'll see if you continue, and they crucified 2 robbers with him. But let's look at it with the historical present. Think of Mark now telling this story, and think of someone then reading his written account out loud to the church or to anyone who is gathered to hear it. Then they bring him to the place Golgotha, which is translated place of a skull. They tried to give him wine mixed with myrrh, but he did not take it. And they crucify him and divide up his garments among themselves. You see the point? And then as you continue, you see below, they crucify two robbers with him, one on his right and one on his left. So that's the storytelling device that I think makes his account. I believe he's using it so frequently because he's telling us a fast-paced account. And here it's as though he wants to take us by the hand and just lead us back to the cross to watch it unfold before our very eyes if we can bear it. Now you'll notice perhaps here down below, let me scroll up again, and you see here how we go from verse 27, and again I hope it's including these markings because sometimes I make markings and for some reason they don't show up in the final recording. But notice verse 27 and then we come to verse 28, but we find it in brackets because this seems to be what we call an interpolation. Just like the ending of Mark, I believe, was added, the long ending was added later. This is a text that seems to be added, and there isn't sufficient evidence for it in the better Greek manuscript evidence. There's just not good testimony to it in the best Greek manuscripts. And so that's why you'll find in some translations, let me clear the way here. For example, here you'll see the ESV, and people will be puzzled because you've got verse 27, and again, I don't know if it's going to show these marks. I'm going to repeat them. And then it goes to verse 29 over here. Well, where is verse 28? It's missing. And then sometimes you'll see memes or you'll see posts on Facebook or in social media saying, look at how these modern translations take away from the Bible. They're removing things from the Bible. But the reality is they're trying to be careful not to include things in the Bible that shouldn't be there, right? That's what we pointed out with the long ending of Mark. Here you'll see that how the NIV does it. They just put verse 28 in brackets, and there's a note to the effect that there is an insertion there that is not in the best manuscript evidence. So that's the NIV. But that's why we've already pointed that out, and that's why we did take the time to look at those issues. So again, I think Mark is wanting us to visualize, and perhaps the scene did not look like this at all, or perhaps there are certain things in this artistic rendering, in this tremendous piece of artwork here. I don't have the information on the artist and the time in which it was made. I wish I would have looked that up. But I do find it quite effective, and it does, the scripture is very limited in the details it gives us about the brutality of Jesus' scourging and the horrific nature of crucifixion. As I said, it's just told in a very matter-of-fact way. But when I read it, especially with that historical present, I can't help but picture in my mind what Mark is telling us about as I read it. So Mark's account is vivid because of how fast-paced it is for the various reasons we suggested. The historical present, the frequent use of that makes it vivid, and then we want to add the rich details that Mark supplies that we don't find in the other gospel accounts, or that one of the other synoptic writers may have repeated from Mark, and I'll give some examples here. In the miracle of the feeding of the 5,000, the other accounts, and that's one of the miracles, one of the only ones that's in all four of the Gospels, not just in all of the synoptics, but in John also. But only Mark tells us that Jesus told them to sit down, not just on the grass, but on the green grass. And it's interesting, John tells us the miracle occurred around the time of Passover, and that is in fact in the spring when the grass in Palestine would be green. So that is one of those interesting and often overlooked incidental details which shows the harmony in the accounts and the accuracy of the accounts in these kinds of details. What about you have a description of the upper room that you find in Mark, but that Matthew leaves off, about it being large and furnished, or the description of Barabbas, the identity of Barabbas. Matthew leaves that off for whatever reason. Mark wants these kinds of details in his gospel, or the scourging, or the lament from the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me? That's the only statement we find from Jesus on the cross in Mark's gospel, but for whatever reason, Luke leaves that off. Luke only says Pilate delivered him over to their will. It doesn't, Luke is not trying to eliminate, obviously, he's not eliminating Jesus' suffering, but comparatively speaking, he's minimizing it for the reasons we talked about when we were looking at Luke's gospel. But these are details that Mark includes, even though Matthew or Luke leaves them off. But you can especially see Mark's penchant for colorful details in a narrative like the healing of the boy with the unclean spirit. Sometimes this is referred to as the healing of the epileptic child. But it's in Mark 9, and we're going to compare it with Matthew's account. You find it in Matthew 17, 14 through 20. It's also in Luke 9, 37 through 43. And Luke's description of it is brief, but he adds a couple of interesting details you don't find in Matthew or Mark. But wow, wait till you see this, if you haven't done this before, where you put Matthew and Mark's account side by side and you see how much longer Mark's account is. And bear in mind, Mark is rushing us through the story, right? So he's trying to hurry us through, and yet he is pausing to give us all of these colorful details that don't really add anything essential to the meaning of the story, but they make it so much more engaging, and they make it come alive, so that when you have an account that's in both Matthew and Mark and Luke, even though Mark's account of it may be the least sophisticated telling, his is often the most memorable. And let's see that now with this account. I'm using blue here to show what's unique to a particular account. So Mark's account from Mark 9 is on the left here, and we're not going to really look too much at Matthew's, except let me scroll through Matthew's and you'll see how brief it is in comparison to what you have in Mark. That's it. That's the whole thing right there. And at the very end, Matthew has Jesus telling the disciples they couldn't cast out the unclean spirit because of their little faith. He said, if you have a faith like a grain of mustard seed, you will say to this mountain, move from here to there, and it will move, and nothing will be impossible to you. So that's added on to Matthew's account. It's not in Mark or Luke. That's why I have it in blue. And Matthew has the miracle occurring instantly, and it could be translated at that very hour. I think the Greek says at that hour. And so it appears to be an idiom for, right at that time. But it was much more involved than that might suggest to Matthew's readers. And what you have in red here is where we have exact, almost verbatim agreement from Matthew and Mark, or Matthew, Mark, and Luke. But now, to the column here on the left, look at all the things that are unique in Mark's account. He mentions verse 14, that they came to the disciples, and only Mark mentions here scribes arguing with them. And then here's one of our immediatelys, right? And immediately all the crowd, when they saw him, were greatly amazed. And they ran up to him and greeted him. And he asked them, "What are you arguing about with them?" And someone from the crowd answered him. So all of that extra setup. And so you're already seeing how Jesus is interacting with the people. Mark wants you to know a lot more about the whole scene and how it's unfolding. And so the man says, "Teacher, I brought my son to you." And only Mark's account here says, "For he has a spirit that makes him mute." Verse 18. "And whenever it seizes him, it throws him down, and he foams and grinds his teeth and becomes rigid." This is horrible, absolutely horrible condition to imagine this child, this son of this unidentified man, how he must have suffered. And Mark's the one that really portrays it so vividly. Luke's account also mentions the foaming and a couple of things. That's why I don't have it in blue if it's found also in Luke. And in Matthew's account, he just relates the falling into the water. You can see right there in verse 15. He often has seizures, suffers terribly. He often falls into the water or into the fire, and often into the water. But let's notice back over here in Mark's account at the end of verse 18, "I asked your disciples to cast it out, and they were not able." And what is fascinating to me is for all the differences in the details in the synoptics, different accounts of the same miracle, they give an exact citation of Jesus' words. And I think that shows you how carefully the actual sayings of Jesus were preserved and handed down through oral tradition. And of course, the Holy Spirit is inspiring Mark to record these things. But we already talked about that when we were looking at the synoptic problem. Notice how they agree verbatim here. "O faithless generation." Now, Matthew has twisted the word "twisted," and that's also in Luke. I think in Luke's it's crooked or perverse is the idea, generation. But, "O faithless generation, how long am I to be with you? How long am I to bear with you? Bring him to me." So there you have the Lord's command, and it's almost exact. But look at all of this that we learn only from Mark. Verse 20, "They brought the boy to him, and when the Spirit saw him immediately," notice we've got our word there again. We've got immediately there again. And so immediately it convulsed the boy, and he fell on the ground. All right, Luke tells you that as well. Matthew doesn't say anything about all of this. Matthew just gives the appearance that Jesus just immediately rebuked the unclean spirit and healed him. But look at this. "And he rolled about, foaming at the mouth." And here's this exchange with Jesus and the boy's father that only Mark tells us. Jesus asked his father, how long has this been happening to him? And he said, "From childhood. And it has often cast him into fire and into water to destroy him." Just stop a minute. Try to read this existentially. Try to imagine seeing this happen to your child. It's absolutely heartbreaking and terrifying to contemplate. But he says, "But if you can do anything, have compassion on us and help us." And Jesus said, "If you can, all things are possible for one who believes." And immediately, there it is again, already 3 times in this account. Immediately, the father of the child cried out, and he said, I believe, help my unbelief." And when Jesus saw that a crowd came running together, that's unique to Mark, he rebuked the unclean spirit. And now only Mark tells us what Jesus said. And look at this. It's fascinating. "You mute and deaf spirit, I command you, come out of him and never enter him again." I like that he tells it never to enter him again. And that might suggest that was a possible danger. We don't have time to explore demon possession right now, but verse 26, "And after crying out and convulsing him terribly. So Matthew over here is just saying, well, and instantly, or he was healed right then. But this was quite a dramatic display, as the demon obviously is controlled by the authority of Christ. He's compelled by the authority of Christ, but look what he does to the boy after crying out. Imagine hearing the sound of this child crying out and convulsing him terribly. It came out, and the boy was like a corpse, so that most of them said, well, he's dead. So that dramatic crying out, all of that convulsing, if you've ever seen anyone have a seizure, it's quite scary, isn't it? But then suddenly silence and stillness, and he's just lying there, and people think he's dead. And then look how tender this is. But Jesus took him by the hand and lifted him up, and he arose. Wow. And then Luke's account has this tender additional detail that Luke's account says, and he gave him back to his father. So beautiful. And then you notice the verbatim here, and why could we not cast him out? Again, when you have a saying, it seems to be that you'll often find it related verbatim. And here, look at this whopper of a conclusion. Wow, it just grabs you. How can it not? Because Jesus said, this cannot be driven out by anything but prayer. Wow. We can't explore that right now, but I just want you to think about that. And Mark's account is the one that tells us it's so mysterious, and that's also characteristic of Mark's gospel. We'll notice that too. But we're at 51 minutes. We need to finish. Next time, we'll look at Markan sandwiches. Yes, and I'll let you look at this delicious double-decker bacon and cheese sandwich and just let your mouth water. Peace to you. May God's grace keep you. And you can just stop now unless you're interested. I think I'll read that text that I shared about the tree that I was looking at and that image that I shared with you at the beginning. And I'll look forward, Lord willing, to being with you next time. Oh, what a sight. What a sight. I took these a few days ago when we were in western New York in the little country town of West Valley, an hour or so south of Buffalo. The first pick, and it's that one here on that you can still see in the side of the frame, is now one of my all-time favorite fall leaves picks I've ever taken. And as you may know, I've taken thousands. But this lovely, luscious maple tree is on the verge of lighting up into a cozy yellow. Then, gently massaged by the crisp fall air, this wondrous work of God will, as He Himself ordained, transition into a rich blend of orange and red, before transforming entirely to cloak the tree in a stunning and delicious deep crimson. This delightful display of red will be short-lived, blessing beholders with such a rare and radiant vision for but a few days, the leaves fading quickly into 1,000 shades of russet before they launch, one after another, to drift lazily to the ground, leaving the stately maple bare and brazen against the cloudy sky as she waits patiently for the first winter snow. I could sit and stare silently at this magnificent work of creation for days on end, utterly enthralled as I watched the tree move mysteriously, silently through these kaleidoscopes of mesmerizing colors, my spirit increasingly overwhelmed at the majesty of our Creator. Thank you, Lord, for revealing your beauty to us in your creation and in such powerful and beautiful sights as this tree, these leaves, this living monument to your greatness, this tender testament to your steadfast love, this silent declaration of your glory now burned into my memory to carry in my heart every day as a witness to your presence among us. Blessed be your name, O Lord, forever and ever.